A quick note before we begin, this video is a re-upload which is attempting to correct a slightly ridiculous problem. You see, despite being a completely uncontroversial video about music composition and Shostakovich, it was flagged by YouTube who thought they detected content unsuitable for advertisers. So they automatically stopped paying me and ceased recommending my video. Now, their detection systems are highly sophisticated. First they look at certain keywords, and then they run them through an incredibly complex, no, I'm joking, they just flag keywords, they haven't a clue how to understand context or anything. This is the company developing DeepMind, by the way. Anyway, as you can probably imagine, many of the keywords they tend to target relate to turmoil that took place around the 1930s and 40s. Take a while to guess what I'm talking about here. The problem for me is that this also happens to be the period where Shostakovich wrote some of his most famous music. So whenever I say things like, this piece was dedicated to the victims of insert name of famous battle or horrible event here, alarm bells at YouTube HQ start to ring. So to fix this, here's what I'm gonna do. When I say the name of this famous leader, let's just call him Jostal, I'm going to add a little bleep. Let's try it out now. Wasn't a very nice man. Okay, there we go. Oh, and there'll be a few other instances of this too. One of them is going to be the name of a certain famous militant group, led by, hold on, let me just draw him. This guy. Let's just call them the Patsies. And I'm also going to bleep out one or two other keywords where I mention in passing some of the terrible things the Patsies did. I mean, what's the alternative? Just make something up? In 1944, Shostakovich wrote this tragically sad piece, for no particular reason. It was just that, or just go swimming. But anyway, enough about all that. Let's get shosting. When I get asked by other composers to name some of my favourite music, I often get a weird response if I mention the name Shostakovich. A look that almost says, huh? I thought you were cool. It feels a bit like saying to an art student that your favourite painting is the Mona Lisa. And I can kind of understand why I get this reaction. In an era where the great pioneers were contributing new ideas, Bartók's ethnomusicology, Schoenberg's 12-tone technique, Stravinsky's use of polyrhythm and additive rhythm, Lutosławski's aleatoricism, Cage's use of chance, Messiaen's modes of limited transposition, Xenakis's application of mathematical models, etc., Shostakovich's music doesn't really seem quite so experimental by comparison. But I feel this attitude does him a big disservice. Of the composers I just mentioned, all certainly suffered during the political upheavals of the 30s and 40s, but Shostakovich stands alone for having to write music under the perpetual scrutiny of ideological sociopaths for the majority of his life. Sociopaths who imposed conservative rules about how art should be created, and who often killed those suspected of disobedience. So, part of Shostakovich's unique contribution to music, which isn't obvious on first listen, is how he worked his way around these restrictions. While all other forms of artistic dissent were being obliterated in the Soviet Union, he still managed to express an intense outrage and sadness via double meaning and clever sleight of hand. So in this video, I'm going to look at some of these interesting features in his music to understand how he composed, along with some wider context to appreciate why. To begin, we need to quickly touch on the political circumstances that he lived through. In 1926, at the age of 19, he achieved international success with his first symphony. During this time, avant-garde and experimental art was tolerated by the Soviet powers, and new and exciting music from the West was still being performed, especially Bartók, Liszt, Krenek, Hindemith, and the foreign Russians Stravinsky and Prokofiev. And in his early years, Shostakovich was influenced by many of these composers, particularly Stravinsky. However, between the mid-20s and the early 30s, as the Soviet government solidified their power, they began banning art forms they disapproved of, especially those from the West. By 1932, the official style of the Soviet Union was announced: Socialist Realism. Its stated purpose was to promote the agenda of the party, spreading messages that were uplifting, while also being comprehensible to the common person. In music, this encouraged composers to produce work laced with patriotism and sentimentality, and new pieces now required official approval too, which further pushed composers towards unimaginative positivity, conventional storytelling, and above all, simplicity. Although this clearly contradicts how we feel about artistic freedom today, it's sometimes easy to read about this period without appreciating quite how insane it was. So to help us get our heads in the game, I've devised a little segment called Let's Be Hello there, my name is Joseph, and today we're going to look at a few artworks together. Jolly good, let's get started. Oh wow, what a way to begin. Look at this commissar dying on the field while his compatriot shields him. What bravery, laying down his life in service of his ideals. The public will learn that they shouldn't mind dying if I ask them to. Very good. What's next? Oh golly, oh this is awful, terrible stuff. Look at these meandering black lines and bits of things going everywhere. Abstraction for the sake of abstraction. There's no story, there's no heroes or horses. Ah, rubbish. No one's gonna do what I say if I show them this. Next. Oh, this one's good. Lots of common folk all dancing and laughing. People will be able to look at this and think, I remember that time when I went dancing. And let me check, none of them seem to be foreign. That's great. Okay, I'm enjoying this. Subscribed. What's next? Oh dear, this is just childish degeneracy. Colour D squares everywhere. It doesn't look like anything you'd see in the real world, although I suppose it does look a bit like a ladder, but no. No, this is awful. I'd like this man shot, please. Can we hear some music? Oh, Saliko. I do love this. So tragic, about coming to terms with the loss of a loved one. Useful. Very, very useful message there, especially with my schedule. Oh no, not this. Not having words is bad enough, but without those, you have to have harmony that at least reminds people of things. All this reminds me of his music I don't like. If people hear weird harmony, they'll act inharmoniously. I can't stand it. Have this man killed. Oh, what's this now? Turtles. What are they? Oh, they band together to help society ward off foreign invaders? Okay, I think this might have promise. Oh, I don't understand. Weird looking animals that live in a ball. This feels very abstract to me. Doesn't remind me of anything. No, I won't tolerate this. Have these Pac-Mans killed. Especially that one. But seriously, this is the kind of mindset that artists living in the Soviet Union had to deal with. And imagine for a moment that this comedic situation was one that actually applied to your life. If you were disobedient, your work might be banned, and if that didn't force you back into step, then you'd likely meet a worse fate, like the theatre director Vsevolod Meyerhold, a close friend of Shostakovich, who was and killed in 1940. Shostakovich observed this happening around him all the time. In the words of his son, Maxim Shostakovich,
страх был, страх за свою семью, как может быть? Глупый только человек может не иметь страха. Умный человек, видя, что исчезают люди, вообще расстреливаются близкие, в нашей семье.
So with all this in mind, it's interesting to listen to Shostakovich's music before this cultural repression really took hold. For example, listen to this proto-ligeti texture from his Second Symphony. As time went on and artistic experimentation came under closer scrutiny, he began providing official justifications that tried to put his music in a context the authorities would find acceptable. One example would be the program note he wrote for his ballet The Golden Age, where a Soviet football team travelling abroad comes into contact with Western culture for the first time. Throwing into contrast the two cultures was my main aim. The West European dances breed the spirit of depraved, which is characteristic of contemporary bourgeois culture. But I tried to imbue the Soviet dances with the wholesome elements of sport and physical culture. But when you listen to the result, it's pretty obvious that the more interesting musical developments are those representing the West. In the words of the lecturer and conductor Michael Parloff, the West gets all the best lines. And this helps to highlight an ongoing argument about Shostakovich's legacy. Are the words we just heard those of a jingoistic communist ideologue, or a somewhat desperate workaround used to justify an interesting musical experiment? The Golden Age was not well regarded by the authorities, and his work came under ever greater scrutiny. But Shostakovich's real woes began in 1936, when Stalin attended his opera Lady Macbeth, only to storm out midway through the performance. A few days later, an anonymous article, which everyone knew was actually approved by himself, appeared in the official newspaper Pravda, titled Muddle Instead of Music. Here's an excerpt. The listener is flabbergasted from the first moments of the opera by an intentionally ungainly muddled flood of sounds. Snatches of melody, embryos of musical phrases drown, escape and drown once more in crashing, gnashing and screeching. Following this music is difficult, remembering it is impossible. And then came the most famous line of the article, a threat that must have made Shostakovich's blood run cold. This is a game that could end very badly. After this event, many of his friends distanced themselves and his rate of commissions dropped significantly. It was the beginning of his back and forth, in favour, out of favour relationship with and his successors, who consistently threatened his personal safety as a means of controlling his musical output. Typically, they wanted his music to celebrate military victories or to extol the progress of the state, directions that, if followed, would result in crass, bombastic, or overly sentimental nonsense. And so began Shostakovich's musical double-dealings, an artistic tightrope walk that became the stuff of legend. This aspect of his music began with his Fifth Symphony, which was accompanied with the telling program note, a Soviet artist's creative response to justified criticism. The music is certainly simpler and less experimental than his previous music, part of an attempt to convince the party to stop vilifying him and banning his work. Since the Fifth is so often discussed in detail elsewhere, I'm not going to dwell on it too much here. One thing of interest to note about it, though, is that it was considered a triumph both by the party, who felt it satisfied their aesthetic requirements, and the public, who largely saw it as an expression of rage and sadness in the face of homegrown tyranny. Two almost diametrically opposed interpretations. The same duality of interpretation can be seen in his Seventh Symphony, written in defiance of the Nazi siege of Leningrad. This is probably Shostakovich's biggest moment on the international stage. It was also propaganda gold for the Soviet Union, so much so that the devised plans to try and disrupt its Leningrad premiere. Probably the only time military operations were devised with classical music in mind. However, despite its clear function as an expression of resistance, again, many thought they also detected a critique of woven into its fabric. When interviewed about this symphony's meaning, Flora Litvinova, a friend and neighbour of Shostakovich, said the following: "He told me directly that the Seventh, and the Fifth as well, are not only about but about our system, in general about any." But I think Shostakovich's true feelings about Soviet rule, and in particular, can be seen most clearly in his Ninth Symphony, a work where his disobedience and humour is on full display. The year was 1945, Germany was defeated, and delighted with the success of the Seventh Symphony, made it clear that he wanted the Ninth Symphony to be a massive triumphant celebration. 9 is a powerful number when it comes to symphonies. Think of the grand ninths of Beethoven, Bruckner and Mahler. Kuhn was aware of this lineage and wanted Shostakovich's ninth to be even more ninethy, louder, longer, even more dramatic. This footage of the victory parade at the Red Square in Moscow gives a sense of the kind of atmosphere we're talking about here. Doesn't exactly get the creative juices flowing, does it? Hey, Shosti, make this. So he was faced with a choice. Should he deliver the self-congratulatory, disingenuous clunker that was being asked of him? Refusing would jeopardise his, along with his family's safety, so he began writing. However, what he delivered was something entirely unexpected. On the surface it seems like the genuine article, but on closer inspection, it's dripping with sarcasm and disobedience. First off, listen to the opening and ask yourself, does this sound epic and heroic to you? No, it sounds chirpy and unconcerned, not at all appropriate for the event. Let's do a quick contrast here. And the more you listen, the more out-of-place things you notice. There's one recurring phrase which seems to promise a big martial moment, but instead just leads to this frivolous little tune. And this idea is used again later, where Shostakovich seems to be openly teasing the Soviet faithful in the audience by constantly using that clumsy sounding bum-bum over and over again. It's like the player, getting ahead of himself, keeps missing his cue, and then finally, after 6 tries, manages to land it in the right place. Shostakovich's music is often sprinkled with little jokes like this, jokes that many interpreted as a comment about the over-eagerness and crassness of the celebration, with the party faithful tripping over themselves to bleat their approval and shout patriotic slogans. One other thing I've always found funny about this movement is the way he repeats the opening twice, harking back to the symphonies of Haydn. It's like a little wink just for composers, reusing a really outdated version of the classical sonata form in, of all things, the opening of a modern Ninth Symphony. To me, it's like a secret note that says, "Look how hard I'm trying." Another thing I find funny about this piece is the key. It's in E-flat major. Just bear with me here. E-flat major was commonly thought of as the most heroic key, famously used in Beethoven's Eroica Symphony. This seems more like a canny optics maneuver rather than an artistic choice. The official authorities needed to rubber stamp the symphony before it could be performed, and the words E-flat major appearing on the score would have been seen as a sign that Shostakovich was intending on being a good boy. In actuality, the heroic key is undermined right at the outset, with the opening phrase being punctuated by this silly-sounding G-flat chord. It at once transforms the effect into something that sounds, well, just completely circusy and silly. However, this time around, Shostakovich's disobedience was a little too obvious, and took it for what it was, a personal insult. And this event marks the beginning of another falling out of favour, culminating in his second denunciation along with Prokofiev and Khachaturian in 1948. Here's a video of the official reprimand where we can see him pathetically clapping along as his name is dragged through the mud. After this event, he was again marked as an enemy of the people and fired from his teaching positions. He would eventually manage to find his way out of this predicament, helped in no small part by death in 1953. But this video is more about his musical voice than his biography, so I'll leave it at that. In the description I've made a few book recommendations for those who are interested in learning more. Just a quick note before we go any further, I personally prefer Shostakovich's chamber music to his orchestral work. One of the reasons for this, I think, is that his chamber works were considered less consequential by the official authorities and were probably not scrutinised as closely. And for this reason they feel freer and sharper to me. One thing I love particularly in his string quartets is how he's able to generate so much music out of very sparse material. For example, the last movement of his ninth string quartet features these two contrasting motifs. He then goes on to use these with remarkable efficiency. The ninth quartet also features one of my favourite moments of pure musical rawness. This sound is characteristic of much of his chamber music, which has a lack of frills that I find appealing, partly because it resembles the spirit of the punk music that I loved growing up. The music is completely exposed, not buried behind any auditory tricks, and yet this rawness is a quality that many of his symphonies don't seem to have, probably due to their highly political nature. I've often found this a little disappointing because it's his symphonic work that's most often presented to the public. And while we're here, I should probably point out that typical short, short, long rhythm that he uses all the time. If you keep a lookout, you'll find this rhythm popping up all over the place. Another notable feature of his music is his keen sense of the grotesque. I think this is best represented by the final movement of a second piano trio, one of the pieces that made me want to be a composer, which presents a ghastly, twisted version of a traditional Jewish wedding dance. Listening to this main theme, it's not hard to identify the use of the altered Dorian mode, which is also called Mi Shebarach in the traditional Jewish music known as klezmer. I also noticed a flattened second later in this theme, which is in keeping with another commonly used mode in klezmer, the altered Phrygian. This offers us another example of potential double meaning in Shostakovich's music. Written in 1944, it was dedicated to his closest friend, Ivan Solzhenitsyn, who died that same year. The fact that Solzhenitsyn was Jewish offers us one clue towards understanding the nature of this final movement. But apart from that, since rumours of the were beginning to reach the Soviet Union, it's entirely possible that Shostakovich was making a wider statement about both abroad and also at home under. This isn't the only time he incorporated obvious klezmer elements into his work, and considering the time he lived in, where Jewish culture was heavily suppressed, it's hard to read it as anything other than a protest against Soviet misrule, as well as a show of solidarity with the Jewish people. Another celebrated aspect of Shostakovich's music is his constant use of quotation, which almost seems like his second language, used to communicate all manner of emotions and ideas. One that often baffles people is his fascination with the gallop theme from Rossini's William Tell. Here it is in his 15th Symphony. And returning back to his 9th Quartet, which is my personal favourite quartet by the way, here it is again. Another repeated motif you find used a lot in his music is his now famous signature, D, E-flat, C and B, or to use the pronunciation of German notation, D-S-C-H. The most famous use of this signature is in his 8th string quartet, which is also a great example of his ability to efficiently create music from very little material. And in the 8th quartet there are no lack of quotations either, although in this case he's quoting himself. Right away you can hear a quote from his 1st symphony, and later on the warped Jewish wedding music we just heard from his 2nd piano trio. And then there's quotes from his 5th, 10th and 11th symphonies, as well as a reference to Lady Macbeth. Why did he do this? One explanation is that the piece was written during a moment of intense personal turmoil, and that there are some signs in his surviving correspondence that he was actually intending on killing himself. And in this context, the 8th quartet paints a very bleak picture, of a composer reflecting on his greatest achievements just before death. Towards the end of his life, his music enters into its late period, which is often so bleak I sometimes find it difficult to listen to. In his last 15 years, he lived in constant pain, and you can hear his fear of death and pessimism taking over in his music, especially his final quartets. Then after his death in 1975, Shostakovich's music became mired in contrary opinions. Official Soviet representatives decided to ignore previous denunciations and held up his work as a shining example of Soviet genius, whereas in the West, the press were happy to characterize him as a sort of weird ideologue. In their obituary, the New York Times noted, "He was also a committed communist who accepted the sometimes harsh ideological criticism to which his modernistic works were periodically subjected." Yep, you really nailed it with that description, guys. And there's also a lot of bitter disagreement between biographers and musicologists too. The book Testimony, which was presented as a signed set of pages documenting the actual words of Shostakovich, caused a sensation when it was released after his death, and still heavily influences how the West interprets his work today. However, serious suspicion about the authenticity of Testimony emerged after numerous academics and close family members cried foul. Many of the lines supposedly recorded during interviews were plagiarized word for word from previously published articles, and Shostakovich's signature, the sole proof of its authenticity, only appears on 8 pages, and those pages contain fairly mundane, uncontroversial material. This has begun a war between those who back the book and those who want to see it completely discredited. Sadly, it does appear that the anti-Soviet bias of the Western press led to testimony being readily accepted. This is a pity because its general presentation of Shostakovich's dislike of Soviet rule have been largely corroborated by those who knew him best. But since the author took so many shortcuts, we just don't know which quotes are true and which are fabrications. And what we're left with is endless speculation about the true meaning of his work from the Fifth Symphony onwards, and his use of coded language continues to fascinate academics today. However, just to put my own cards on the table here, regardless of which stories and interpretations are overblown, I feel we have enough surviving correspondence, factual material, and interviews with those who knew him to get a good idea of where his general sympathies lay, and the version of him I've presented here is the one I have the most faith in. I mean, twice denounced him and also killed a whole bunch of his friends and family. He was hardly gonna love the guy. So to answer those who criticise Shostakovich because he didn't author some new technique like serialism, I hope I've successfully made the case that he deserves a place among the great pioneers due to his legacy of overcoming ludicrous artistic repression and connecting with listeners through a mixture of intricate musical messages and sheer raw talent. And if you don't buy that response, or if you think his music was nothing more than safe, easy listening, one thing that can't be denied is that his voice is among the most easily identifiable in all classical music. No one else sounds like him, and that alone is probably the highest praise you can give a composer.
If you like my diatribe, subscribe.